welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
Happy belated birthday, by the way.
Thanks.
Thanks for traveling down to Orlando on your birthday. That's a nice thing. Probably has resulted in a few extra people here, so that's awesome too. So what we try and do with these little fireside chats is talk a little bit about current events with Microsoft, where we think things are going, and also leave some time for audience Q&A. So we'll work on doing all of that. And boy, there are a couple of current events that are very current that I think we can chat about. But before we get there, let's start at kind of a higher level and talk about Windows 10 and how it's going overall, and how we think, how you think, I should stop talking like a nurse, how Windows 10 is kind of impacting the Windows ecosystem overall relative to maybe some influence in the other direction from Windows 8. What's the health of the Windows platform right now relative to where it's been the last few years?
Well, I have to put myself in that group of people who was not a huge Windows 8 fan. And the reason is I'm somebody, like probably many of you here, who prefer a mouse and keyboard or still use a mouse and keyboard very frequently. So I couldn't have been happier when I heard that Microsoft was going to supersede Windows 8 with Windows 10. I've heard pretty positive reception out there about Windows 10 from customers of all sizes. I mean, there are some people who still are holding on to Windows 8, but right now Microsoft's saying they have over 110 million activations of Windows 10, not just sales into the channel, but actual activations of the operating system. And they haven't even really started selling it yet. Those are just free upgrades primarily, though not entirely. There are a few, I believe there's about between 10 and 20 million of those are sales to enterprises, but the rest are mostly free upgrades. So I think I would give the operating system so far pretty high marks for reception among people out there of all types.
And beyond the free part of that, what that means is the vast majority thus far has been consumer adoption.
Right.
So, and if we think of Windows as kind of the business operating system, then this should really just be an appetizer for what's coming. What about on the hardware end? Because it seems like Microsoft's forays into the world of hardware really to showcase Windows 10 at its best. I heard a rumor that you have a Surface Book.
I do.
How do you like that so far? And I've also heard some rumors about some firmware bugs and so forth, but relative to that, what's the overall experience?
Yep, I do have a Surface Book. It's a loaner that I got from Microsoft, and I brought it here in case at the end anybody who hasn't gotten to see one in the flesh wants to see it. I'll show you mine. I like the Surface Book. I don't love it. I do like it. I wanted Microsoft to build a real laptop, and I'm not a big fan of the two-in-one, though I know many people are. Microsoft did one thing very well this year with the OEMs that I think is quite different from what they did with Windows 8, which is they talked to the OEMs a lot earlier in the process when they were building Windows 10 than they did with Windows 8. So with Windows 8, the idea was, let's keep the operating system a secret from everyone, and that even meant, unfortunately, the PC makers. So when Windows 8 debuted, there wasn't a lot of new hardware available right away to take advantage of all the new touch enhancements and other new features. But Microsoft did this very differently with Windows 10, and this holiday, I think you're going to see a lot of laptops, desktops, all-in-ones, all different kinds of devices that will be running Windows 10 available in consumer channels and business channels, and I think that is a big plus, for sure.
It was kind of perplexing with Windows 8 because the sweet spot was sort of the two-in-one and touchscreen laptops, not just tablets, but touchscreen laptops, but there were none in the channel. And it seemed to be based on a communications issue. That seems to be largely corrected now. I think
Yes.
is where you're going with that.
Although,
And
I'll say
go ahead.
not entirely corrected. There are some things that I'm surprised to see OEMs not taking advantage of or taking advantage of in an odd way. An example is we've been seeing some new PCs coming out with the Hello camera facial recognition on the back instead of the front. Have you noticed this?
No, a Windows Hello camera on the wrong side of the wrong side of the machine.
And what we've heard, although this is just a rumor, I don't know this for a fact.
That would be Windows goodbye, I guess.
It kind of would. What we've heard is Microsoft didn't completely disclose Hello even to the OEMs because they didn't want that technology to leak. They and Intel built that together, and so OEMs didn't really know that was coming. They knew what Intel had been doing around some of the RealSense camera work, and so this is why supposedly you see the cameras on the back on some of these machines.
Okay.
Not too helpful.
I'm not quite sure what to make of that exactly, but
good question, right? I know, right? What people say is they're pitching it as a field of depth camera instead of a facial recognition camera. I don't know.
It's funny, I thought you said field of death. And
Field of depth camera.
It's like, what? That's a new
Have you heard
three-letter
of those
acronym on me. All right. What about the retail experience? People should know we both live in New York. We only see each other in Orlando lately.
Pretty
but,
much, yeah.
We both live in New York. New York finally has a Microsoft store in Manhattan.
Yep.
We only had a pop-up store in the Time Warner Center, which wasn't much. Now we have a full store, and it's the flagship store. And it's down the street from the Apple flagship.
It is.
Yeah. Saturday Night Live had kind of a choice joke about that when it was announced, but I'll tell you that one later. But you've been there. I think you even got to go to a before party before it opened.
Yep.
So what's the store like, and what's your kind of take on the Microsoft retail effort overall? Because all these things work together, right?
They do.
Windows 10, the hardware, and the
Right.
stores.
Yep. So the new store is really great. If you get to Manhattan, you should go check it out. It's on 5th Avenue and 53rd Street. It's 5 stories. Microsoft has 4 of them for the store, and I think the 5th is either storage or the landlord. But what's really interesting about that store is the 3rd floor is a Dell store within the Microsoft store. It's a dedicated Dell store, and I think it's because Dell is helping them pay the rent on this really expensive space. That's my guess. But the store is really beautiful.
Even Microsoft needs help
They need
paying
some
Manhattan
help,
rents.
yeah.
I understand. I feel
It's a
their
really,
pain.
really beautiful store, though. The ground floor has not just Microsoft hardware, but it has laptops and tablets from third parties. The 2nd floor is a community space, and they're having all kinds of classes for kids and adults on Microsoft technologies, from Minecraft all the way to SQL Server. You can go in for free classes. You can bring your laptop, even if you didn't buy it from them, to the store, and they'll help you diagnose it for free. So the equivalent of a Genius Bar with people who aren't in, what would I say?
People
Who
what, are over the drinking age?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say not hipsters, but
Yeah.
And they have other technologies in there too. There's Surface Hubs in there, which are those really big conferencing systems that you can use with multi-touch. They have a Skype translator, a dedicated system for that. So if you're someone who has any interest or even very little interest in just laptops and PCs and tablets, you'll be able to go in there and see Xbox and Minecraft and Skype, the whole family of all the different Microsoft products. And they're making the community space available to others. We're going to have Windows Weekly broadcast live out of the store in December. Yep.
Wow.
I know.
So you won't be working from your apartment on those anymore.
Exactly.
You'll have a little more elbow room.
A little more.
So Microsoft's sort of helping to pay your rent in a way.
You know, I was a big advocate, I wish. I've been a big advocate of Microsoft doing a store, and a lot of people ask me why. They said, oh, who cares about a store? Like, is that the way people buy PCs anymore? I don't know if I would actually go in there and buy a PC, but what I like is you can see all the different PCs side by side. And that's a hard experience to have, especially in Manhattan, if you go to Best Buy, which has a store within a store. A lot of times the displays aren't up to date, or things are missing or stolen. One time I went in there to lift up a laptop that I was thinking of buying to see the weight, and I set off the alarm. And everyone came running to see if I was stealing the laptop. So it makes it hard to shop there.
Yeah.
So I think it's nice to have a place where the people actually know the products. You don't feel like you have to answer, why are you a Windows user, like you do when you go into an Apple store. They actually say that to you when you go into an Apple store.
What do they say?
Why are you a Microsoft customer?
Oh, yeah.
If you bring that up. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it's good. And I don't know if they'll actually make money on that store. I don't even know if they're making money on their stores at this point. But I think it's good for them, at least just from a publicity and public exposure standpoint, to have some of these stores in big cities.
Yeah. I have to say the answer to that question, and I have an iPhone, I have an iPad, I even work somewhere that makes me use a Mac. I'm the only one I know who has to use a Mac at work and uses Windows at home. But the answer is usually, I'm trying to get some work done, dude. That's why. All right. What's next for Surface, do you think? And by the way, we haven't talked about, Surface Pro. We've talked about Surface Book. So wrap that up in there.
Okay.
What's next for this brand?
So Microsoft has turned Surface from just being a brand for its tablets to a bigger brand now. And they have one person in charge of this brand, Panos Panay. He is in charge of what's called premium hardware at Microsoft. And so Surface has become the brand for premium hardware, which means not just tablets and PCs like the Surface Book and the Surface Pro and the Surface, but also maybe a Surface phone in the future. The Surface Hub is part of his domain. So anything where Microsoft is actually designing, manufacturing, and marketing its own premium hardware is going to be part of that family. And so when you think about what it means to be a Surface branded product, I think it means you share more common elements across the family, not just you run Windows 10 on all of them, but you have more of the similar design elements. So the similar look and feel of the external case, maybe the pen becomes a similar design element even across the phone brand. So I think the future of Surface is premium hardware from Microsoft. Whether or not Microsoft actually builds it or contracts with someone to build it, it'll still be Microsoft hardware, Microsoft branded, designed. And I think they've got a lot more things coming from what we're hearing. I think the next thing is more Surface Pro, more basic Surface tablets, and probably a Surface phone.
I'm starting to see a lot more Surfaces in the wild in Manhattan.
Right.
Hipster doofus issues notwithstanding. I'm starting to see them show up. You mentioned the possibility of a Surface phone, and I don't know if we have to speculate on that specifically, but what about Windows Phone or Windows 10 Mobile or the platform? I mean, we got some new hero hardware, but just the two models. The real, I don't know, vim and vigor behind it seems a little bit tepid.
Yeah.
And there was just some development, maybe you could fill us in, on the bridge technology to bring Android software, Android apps, to bring them onto the Windows mobile platform. So what's going on overall and with those bridges?
So first, I should be giving you a disclaimer. I'm one of the 1.9%. I bought it with my own money. I'm a Windows Phone user. People think I'm crazy. I'm still holding on. I like Windows Phone. I'm sad to see what's happening with the platform, but I think Microsoft's being realistic, and they're trying to figure out where the sweet spots might be for them to hold on to some share in this market. So they've said publicly that they plan to make a lot fewer Windows Phone models going forward. They're going to have a maximum of 2 business phones, 2 phones for fans or enthusiasts, and 2 phones for people in the developing world that are more geared towards selling Microsoft services, not surfaces, per year. So instead of having almost a phone a day be introduced under the Lumia brands and the Nokia brands, they're going to cut it way back. They're going to focus it more. That means some painful interim steps for us on the Windows Phone platform, I think. As you mentioned,
you're used to them.
I'm used to them. I'm kind of used to those. This holiday season, in fact, in a few more days, you'll see the first 2 new Lumias in a while. It's the 950 and the 950 XL. AT&T has a 950 going on sale this Friday on the 20th. And I'm a Verizon user, so I'm thinking I'm probably not getting either of these phones because I don't think they're going to work on Verizon. They are going to be sold unlocked in the Microsoft stores, which is good. And I kind of feel like these phones are a stopgap, that they're just kind of meant to tide over the people who are sticking with the platform until next year when Microsoft comes out with some new models that maybe are not things that were in the Nokia pipeline, but they're newly designed phones from Microsoft. On the Bridges technology stuff, I don't know how many people here were at Build this year, which is Microsoft's big developer conference, but they made a very big deal out of how they were planning to try to close the app gap between Windows Mobile and iOS and Android. And a big piece of that strategy was this technology they called the bridging technology. So they introduced 4 different bridges there. One was meant to get iOS developers to port their apps over to be Windows Phone apps. One was for Android developers to port their apps. One was for people who develop web apps to be able to turn websites into apps and have those on the Windows Store. And the last was for Win32 developers to get their apps packaged to be Windows Store apps and available that way. So far, the only bridge that's out is the one that wraps the web apps and makes those available as store apps. Last week, there was a rumor that Microsoft has killed the bridging technology to bring Android to Windows Phone. When we asked Microsoft, all of us press types, for comment, they gave us a very bland comment that you couldn't really tell whether it meant that technology was alive or dead. So everyone wrote it was dead. Developers I know who are working in the private tech preview program for that technology, which is codenamed Astoria, which is the name of a bridge, they told me they haven't heard anything from Microsoft since September, and the forums that are all behind a firewall are completely dead and no one's answering any questions. I'm not optimistic about that. But you know, a lot of people when Microsoft introduced the Android bridge were wondering why they did it, because part of that bridge included emulation technology to let Android apps run on Windows Phone. So people who are Microsoft developers said, well, why would I even get a Windows Phone if it's for running Android apps? Why wouldn't I get an Android phone? So there was...
Because it's working out so well for BlackBerry.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I don't know if Microsoft has killed that bridging technology since introducing it very publicly. I do know they're not really talking much about it. The iOS bridging technology, though, they've actually open sourced that code, and there are people working with that technology and trying to see if they can bring their iOS code over easily to Windows Phone. So I'm actually more interested in seeing iOS apps on Windows Phone than I am on Android.
All right. We'll have to see how that goes. I appreciate your opinion for a number of reasons. One of them is that you wrote a book about Microsoft. Microsoft 2.0, you wrote that back in 2008. And if I can sort of cherry pick some things that you talked about that came to pass, this was before Azure, and you basically talked about Azure. There was, I guess, a project called Red Dog that you thought would end up being very, very important, and Red Dog essentially became Azure. You had this crazy idea about how people would start subscribing to Office instead of buying a perpetual license for it. That worked out okay. Check. What were some other things you talked about in that book that seem to have come to pass, and maybe some things that haven't?
Well, one of the things I talked about that I still remember, because it was a little embarrassing at the time, was in 2008, Microsoft had hired Ray Ozzie to be their chief technology officer. He was handpicked by Bill Gates to come in and kind of replace him as the chief software architect. And I wrote in my book that I thought Ray Ozzie would resign or be fired. And he did resign. But before that happened, one day I had a meeting with Ray Ozzie after my book came out, and he said, "Hey, I like what you said about me in your book." And I was like, "Yeah, sorry." But he said, "No, the best part was I didn't even know you said it, and people started buying copies of your book and highlighting the part about me getting fired or resigning and mailing them to me." So I have like 20 copies of your book with that highlighted, if you need any of them. And when he did leave, I remember sending him a note, and I said, "Well..."
You should have sent him a copy of the book with that section on it.
Yeah. And I think a lot of Ray Ozzie, and I said that I thought he would leave more because of politics and Microsoft's culture at that point of not really welcoming people who had been hired from the outside in. And I said, he's kind of an outsider, and I didn't think he'd last. So,
right.
Yeah, that I remember that as being one of the things that I thought would happen. But I talked in my book about some of the things I thought would happen with Windows Live and how that would become more kind of part of the Windows ecosystem and operating system, which it has through some of the services like OneDrive and Outlook.com. So yeah, it was interesting doing a book about the future when Microsoft really decided they weren't going to talk to me for the book. So it was good. It was a good experience, and I'll never write a book again.
I'm with you there.
Yeah.
I wrote this great book on SQL Server that we updated.
It's like this big, I remember.
Yeah. So we updated it twice, and the last version we updated it for was SQL Server 2012. So that's about to be 2 versions out of date. Let's talk about, well, you kind of segued there anyway, the cloud. We've got Amazon Web Services here. We've got Microsoft here. In the startup community, it's been the case for a while that when people think about the cloud, it goes by default to Amazon. Microsoft hasn't even entered the conversation. I've seen that start to change. What are you seeing in the marketplace from your readers, from your tipsters, in terms of traction for Azure versus Amazon, but also versus the other players, including Google and IBM?
So I too am seeing it pick up a bit. And what's interesting to me about Microsoft in the cloud is, well, a bunch of different things, but a lot of the moves they've been making lately in open source have been super interesting because I think people are just so surprised when they see Microsoft on stage with Docker or Chef or Puppet or any of these companies, and even the people they have on stage with them sometimes say, "Yeah, I can't believe I'm here either. It's really weird that I'm on stage with Microsoft." So I think that new feeling of openness towards the open source community, towards some of the companies that are doing very cutting edge work around microservices and containerization, it's surprising people who wrote Microsoft off as just being in the cloud to push Windows Server and its own products. So I think that perception's starting to change quite a bit. And I have to say, the announcement a couple weeks ago that Red Hat is now finally available on Azure was a long time in coming and very surprising that it finally all came together.
That question would come up again and again.
Every time,
yeah.
every time.
Ubuntu's great, but what about Red Hat?
Right. And if you kind of comb through that announcement, there are some very interesting pieces around what Red Hat did and did not concede to make that deal happen. They did not admit that they were infringing on any Microsoft patents, which is interesting. They also, I think they said something about they did not pay Microsoft anything to license the technology, which some of the other companies have. But again, a very interesting announcement that it shows to me that Microsoft is willing to pull out all the stops and do what customers really want them to do to bring more people into the cloud. They're also doing a ton around trying to get startups and smaller vendors interested in Azure, people who just kind of wrote it off and said, I know Microsoft's going to be more expensive, so I'm not even going to look at them. They have a lot more outreach programs to that community, those different communities now, through all different kinds of events they attend, hackathons, giving away cloud credits and such. So I feel like there is a lot more kind of reconsideration about Azure from people who had written it off before. I have to say, on Google and the cloud, whenever you talk to analysts, they always say, okay, it's Amazon way up here, then it's Azure, and then it's Google. I never hear from people using Google. I know they're out there, people who are using the Google Cloud, but I just kind of feel like Google looks more like an also-ran in the public cloud now than Microsoft does.
Yeah, I think that's true. I work for a big data company called Datamere. Everything we do is about Hadoop. Everything we write is in Java. I mentioned the fact that the standard issue machine is a Mac. Our guy doesn't even want us using Office. He wants us to use Numbers and Keynote and Pages, which, by the way, I refuse to do. But that's neither here nor there. But we're bringing out our first major cloud offering, and we ended up partnering with Microsoft and HD Insight to do it, and not Amazon and Elastic MapReduce. Now, that may come, but the idea that Azure comes first, it's not because I'm there, right? It's because Azure, first of all, Microsoft is just more, the outreach is better to the beyond Windows world, number one. But number two, HD Insight is now available both in a Windows flavor and in a Linux flavor. That made things easier for us. So then it could be a business choice instead of a platform choice. And I spoke with someone on the team recently, and I was asking him why there were some differences between the default settings on the Windows side of HD Insight and the Linux side. And he said to me, if you're really doing a lot of work with HD Insight, you should really go to the Linux version first. That was a guy from the product team. So I think we're seeing, a very different Microsoft. And that's, that's no small thing.
No.
You mentioned sort of open source in general. What about the fact that .NET is, the core framework and its availability on Mac and Linux? You see that impacting?
Yeah.
Turning heads, winning over any hearts and minds, or is it a gimmick?
No, I think it is going to impact people. I'm kind of surprised Microsoft's not talking about that a lot more right now. So they are working on ASP.NET 5, and they're working on it publicly on GitHub. And they keep telling me this is why they're not talking about it as much to us in the press and publicly. They're like, well, you can just look at GitHub and see what we're doing. But I think people have forgotten after last year where they made a big splash about bringing .NET Core to Mac and Linux and Windows and all the work they're doing around ASP.NET. I'm betting we're going to hear a lot more about that early next year because that's when it's actually supposed to be done. And I have people, I'm not kidding, I have people emailing me at least once a week saying, when are you going to write more about ASP.NET? When are you going to say more about .NET going cross-platform? I want to hear more about that. So I think there is demand. I think Microsoft's just trying to hold back. I don't know if they'll say more about that this week. They have a big developer event in New York called Connect this week, and maybe they'll talk some more about that there.
I was hearing from some folks at the MVP Summit the week before last that Google evangelists are starting to do a lot of their demos in Visual Studio Code.
Oh, wow.
So,
That's funny.
it's really a different era. And those things, I think, add up. It's not that I think there used to be this sort of naive sense within Microsoft that they would sort of have an initiative, go to market with it, and expected, to be inundated with applause and accolades.
Yeah.
And of course, that's not how the market works. And usually the market is cynical about things that Microsoft bring. But when there's sustained effort and you have initiative on top of initiative, this is a very different kind of approach. But good to hear that you're hearing so much demand around .NET in general, and interesting to hear that the open source part of that seems to be a big feeder. Another kind of open sourcey topic is having community editions of products, like Visual Studio Community. And wow, there's a whole bunch of questions in here. Let's just do a couple of them, and then let's get to the audience for some questions. But we've got this community edition of Visual Studio, which is a very fully functioned version of the product. I'm using it in my demos now, because in many ways it's all I need.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Microsoft's still in the business of selling tools. And, well, actually, the gentleman who has been the head of the developer division, which is tasked with that for many years, is leaving the company.
Right.
So, not that there is a cause and effect relationship. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But how do you see the revenue stream on tools evolving? And is there a cannibalistic effect, do you think, from the community editions?
Well, the community, as I remember it, the community edition is only for small
It's for small
shops,
teams
right.
and open source developers.
Right, and academics, right? Yeah. So I think that to some degree limits who can use that product. It's kind of like how Microsoft's giving away Windows 10 for free, but not to enterprises, right? So they know where their biggest revenue stream is. It's big business. They, I think, feel they can do a lot of things with goodwill if you give away the entry-level product, get people hooked on it. Then as they need to expand or go up market, they'll be like, well, I know Visual Studio, so let's buy the license. So I'm sure there's some cannibalization effect, just like there is with Windows, but I don't think it's probably huge.
Do you think the evangelistic impact of having a free, full functional edition possibly outweighs whatever cannibalistic effect is there?
Probably.
Yeah.
Do you?
I do.
Yeah, I do too, because I think every time you hear from people who are criticizing Visual Studio, a big criticism is how expensive it is. It's like, why does Microsoft charge so much for their development tools? So when you take that part out of the equation and say, okay, if you want to try the community edition and see if you think it's worth the money, that gets more interesting.
Yeah. And I mentioned that the head of the developer division is leaving Microsoft. That's Soma Somasegar. Have you had a chance to talk to him since his announcement?
I have. I'm really sad he's leaving.
Yeah.
Some people at Microsoft, when they leave, you have a little wheels up party. Soma, no. I'm just sad to see him go.
Yeah.
And
big loss.
He said to me very explicitly, I'm not retiring. Watch what I do next. I don't know what he's going to do next.
Good.
I also don't really know why he left. People have asked me what's the scuttlebutt about why he left. I don't know why he left.
I've talked to lots of people. Nobody seems to know. I talked to one or two who actually thought they saw this coming, but they have no explanation for it. So I'm interested to see what's next.
We'll keep digging.
Yeah. All right, so we've got 20 minutes or so left, and we're happy to, I've got lots more questions I can ask, but we're very happy to take questions from the audience. We have microphones set up in each of the 3 aisles, one to my right, one in the center, one to my left. Looks like we have a gentleman approaching to my left. So you've got the floor, sir.
Thank you, sir. As I'm never one short for words, I will also openly admit my anti-Microsoft bias. So that helps frame where I'm coming from. And I think that your comments regarding the Visual Studio Community Edition interesting, because I have a completely different take on how that's playing out. The impression that I have is that Microsoft is giving more and more in each Visual Studio Edition, and they previously had a model where they were very happily making money off of developers' backs. If you ever looked at the pricing for Visual Studio Ultimate, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You're like, you want how much for an IDE? It was a very pricey proposition. when you look at what they've done with the recent release, when you look at what they've done with the bridges, what I saw was a very clear announcement of, we're not so this is from Microsoft's perspective, we're not so interested in making money off of developers' backs anymore. We're more interested in taking a cut out of the application store. So you sell 1 million products, well, we're getting a 1% cut off of that, and that's where we're going to make our profit. So I saw them pushing more features into effectively lower levels of the Visual Studio Enterprise as a way of making it more accessible. But what I hear you saying tonight is actually contradictory towards that. So I'd be curious to hear what both of your opinions are of the, do you think that Microsoft has exited the IDE as a profit or a profit center area, or where do you think that they're really addressing that? How do you think that they're treating that from their end bottom line?
You want to take that first?
Yeah.
Sure.
So I haven't gotten a recent update to this, but I think it was a year or two ago, Visual Studio Tools was one of Microsoft's dozen or so billion-dollar businesses just by itself. So they were making $1 billion just from selling different editions of Visual Studio. So I don't think they're hurting for revenue on Visual Studio. I think they definitely still see it as a profitable business and one that they intend to make profit on. I think you're right, though, that there's another way they make a profit. Once they get people in with Visual Studio and they develop Windows Store apps, Microsoft does get a cut. But I don't think they're looking at that as kind of a way to shore up a failing business or a falling business. I think it's just supplementary income to what they're making on selling tools. I had a guy just today on Twitter fighting with me, surprise, fighting on Twitter, who said, you know what I hate about Microsoft? And I'm like, oh, wow, here we go.
It's a loaded question, but sure.
His point was, I am a long-term Windows developer, and I am really mad that Microsoft's not doing more tools to help me port my apps to iOS and Android. And I'm like, well, why do you think Microsoft would do that? Like, what's in it for Microsoft? And he said, who cares what's in it for Microsoft? Yeah. I'm like, well, Microsoft cares, right? I said, I'm not defending them. I'm not trying to help them make money. I'm just saying this is how they approach the problem. Like, how do we make money? We're a for-profit company, right? And he said, they owe me. I've been a long-time .NET developer. I said, I don't know what else to say. Sorry.
Yeah, really.
I brought up Xamarin. I brought up some of the partnerships Microsoft's doing to help people who know C# and other .NET languages to port their apps to other platforms, but not to port them necessarily from Windows Phone to iOS or Android.
Yeah, that might be a small sliver of the marketplace anyway.
Yeah, I know. I was kind of curious about that.
The concept of diminishing returns comes up. I think in terms of the pricing of Visual Studio and Enterprise, I think you have to understand the context where a lot of that pricing came from. It's actually from a prior era when big ALM tools from the likes of Rational, which got acquired by IBM and so forth, were very, very high. And Microsoft wanted to get in that market and actually, to use a Microsoft term, democratize it. And if you look at Visual Studio Enterprise compared to a full suite of a lot of those tools, it came in lower. Yeah. But that really is an older era.
True.
The market always monetizes somewhere. Nobody is in this business just to feel good. Right. The vendors really aren't. And the ones that are able to do that because they have venture funding and they kind of don't have to think about the bottom line because their business model is fundraising rather than real revenue. Right. But I think Microsoft sees that the monetization is happening in a different place. So I don't know if I'd word it as they wanted to make money off the backs of developers before and now they don't. But it was a general approach in the market that enterprise tools had enterprise pricing, and you didn't let lower-end developers into the enterprise tool chain. That's changing, and at this point, there's always going to be premium products and areas. There's always going to be commoditized products and areas. And the dev tools over the last several years have become more commoditized because of open source, because of the fact that ecosystem is so important. Ecosystem grows when tools are free. And I think Microsoft, no pun intended on rational, but Microsoft has rationalized its SKUs and its price list based on changes in the marketplace. There's just some lag time around that.
Yeah.
So I think that's fair. Do we have any other audience questions? Looks like we have a customer right here.
Yeah, I'm just curious about your opinion about the changing of the guard. It seems like a lot of change has been made with Satya taking over. So, and I haven't heard you talk much about him.
Yeah, we didn't this time
No.
because we've talked so much about Satya Nadella before, but that's probably not a good excuse. We should talk about him. And there's been another, Microsoft always reorgs. So there was a recent one in cloud and enterprise where things changed a little bit, especially in the data world. There was a bit of a change of the guard. So yeah, who's in and who's out? Where, how's that football game going?
Yes, so Satya's been there, as of next February, it'll be 2 years. He'll have been CEO, which is kind of amazing. And I think when he took over, I was expecting it to not be a very different Microsoft. I thought, he's been at Microsoft 20 odd years. It's going to be business as usual. He'll make some tweaks, but it's going to be pretty much the Microsoft we know. And boy, it sure has not been that. I don't give him credit for everything that's happened since he took over. Some of those decisions that were made were already in the pipeline from Steve Ballmer, but I feel like starting now, pretty much, or starting and going into his second year, it's going to be more decisions that he is the author of and that he'll be the one putting into the pipeline. He's shaken up the senior leadership team quite a bit. They've brought in some new blood there. They're changing their board membership around, and if Steve
Ballmer's not on the board anymore, is he?
No, he's not. But the board is up for election on December 1st. That's the shareholders meeting, and if they do pass the two candidates who Microsoft has requested, 2 more women will be on the board. One is the former CTO of Cisco, which will be interesting. So yeah, I think there's been a lot of changing in terms of the people and a lot of the stuff around what Satya's done with deciding that Microsoft was going to get rid of the Nokia business basically by closing down a lot of the plants that they bought when they purchased the Nokia handset division. That all happened on his watch. So you're seeing his idea that Microsoft is a software and services company, very focused on productivity, really kind of move forward. And he's, I think, starting to really put his stamp on the company.
What about the guy in the red shirt?
That guy?
Scott Guthrie. What's
Guthrie.
his future look like?
Yeah, he's still there and still running cloud and enterprise. That's an interesting point, though. The people who are running the main 3 business units at Microsoft, Scott Guthrie runs cloud and enterprise, Chi Lu runs applications and services, and Terry Myerson's now running both Windows and devices. They're long-term guys. They've been there. I mean, Chi Lu's the newest of those, I think.
Yeah. I mean, this last reorg, Scott Guthrie got more stuff.
Yep, even more stuff.
Dynamics is now under him.
Yep, which is very interesting, right? So ERP and CRM now is part of Scott Gu's organization from an engineering standpoint. So yeah, he's definitely getting more power there. Very interesting.
And he's in Satya's old job.
He is.
Right? So that's a post with a certain amount of prestige
it is.
now.
He's still wearing red shirts.
He's still wearing red shirts. Kind of funny, at the MVP summit, he was going to meet with a few people. He ended up not being able to make it. But they all got autographed red shirts.
Nice.
So there was your consolation prize.
Nice.
So the cult of Guthrie has clearly
Yes.
grown. Do we have another questioner at the microphone?
I think so.
Sure. Mary Jo, it's good to see you in person. I read your stuff a lot, and it's good to see you in person. You said you weren't going to write another book, but if you were to write what Microsoft 3.0 would be, what would that? No?
You don't even want to answer the question, right?
Okay, let's say it's a blog. Let's say you're going to put the content on a blog then.
Yeah, it can be a really short book this time, honest.
It's funny.
Just a couple predictions, I guess.
Yeah, people are asking me if I am going to write Microsoft 3.0, which I think somebody should write this book, but not me.
Well, especially since Microsoft always gets it right on the third version.
That's true.
Yeah. So there's a sort of meta.
Yeah. I just, writing a book is very interesting if you've never done it. It kind of shows you, kind of what your strengths and weaknesses are. And if you're somebody who likes to procrastinate like me, it's not a good thing. Yeah, so I just didn't enjoy writing a book. I think it also was, I wrote a book about Microsoft while I was blogging full-time about Microsoft. I didn't take time off from my job while I was doing it. And at night, I was dreaming about Microsoft. I'd wake up in a cold sweat like I had just had a conversation with somebody. It was like every waking moment was Microsoft instead of only half my waking moments, and it was just too much.
Prognostication is what I was looking for.
Prognostication.
Yeah, he doesn't really want you to write another book.
Okay,
he
you just want
wants the
future
cliff
pick.
notes from what would be Microsoft 3.0.
I'm going to be doing a column pretty soon for Redmond Magazine about my predictions for next year. So if you can wait a month.
That's it?
Yep. I don't know. I mean, do you have something specific, an area? Because, Microsoft is so huge.
Yeah.
But he mentioned Azure, for example.
Yep.
And that's something that you see anything that's sort of, it's a wave ready to happen, but we don't know about that yet.
Well, I bet you know about this, but I would keep my eyes on what Microsoft is doing with their platform as a service part of Azure. They're doing this new architecture for that called the Azure Service Fabric. And I'm super interested to see what they do with that because their platform as a service piece of Azure has not had huge uptake. It's been somewhat successful, but not huge. And they're going at it now from more of a microservices bent. Mark Rusinovich has talked a lot about it and done some really good Channel 9 and other kinds of videos about where this technology is going in general. And I think that it's going to be interesting to see if that gives them more traction on that part of their cloud business.
Yeah, I did a talk on it at work last week.
Oh, nice.
Cool. Other question?
So I'll try a question. We see that last year, Microsoft announced unlimited OneDrive space, and now November 2nd, they took that back and said 1 terabyte. And just because people were uploading huge movie files, do you see that maybe they'll bring that back and say...
I didn't have to ask you. It came up organically.
So they'll bring it back and say, maybe if you have smaller files, and we see as the future progresses, our files are just becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. And with the whole ecosystem, they want us to have one big Microsoft ecosystem where we're sharing files among all of our devices. How do you see the future coming with, again, that unlimited, or are we going to be paying to be able to have all this storage in one ecosystem?
Yeah, we forgot to talk about OneDrive. I think because it's such a painful topic. Like you mentioned, a couple weeks ago, Microsoft kind of came in and did a slash and burn on the unlimited offer on consumer. And I can tell you the bits I've heard about why they did this. It wasn't really about people abusing the file system. That was the public answer to that. But what we hear happened was the bean counters at Microsoft, the CFO in particular, Amy Hood, she periodically looks at all of the businesses at Microsoft, and she looked at OneDrive and said, how are you guys making money? Oh, you're not. Right. Well, why are we giving away all this storage and we're not charging for it? I mean, they're charging in some plans, right? But I think that's more likely what happened was they didn't have a way to talk about how they were making money with OneDrive. Instead, they had a year ago done what a lot of the other storage vendors were doing, which was upping and upping and upping the stakes in the race to give away the most storage. So I think they're going to come back and have some plans that you can buy that are like interim steps if you need more than a terabyte or more than however much storage you're going to get once they finish doing all the realignment. But so far they haven't said anything. They won't talk about it. They also won't talk about what they're going to do with OneDrive for Business. We've asked a few times on that, and we can't get
Speaking of
anything.
Ray Ozzie.
Yeah. So I'm not sure what's going to happen on that side. They just have to really get their house in order on OneDrive. I feel like there's a lot of bad things happening there, from removal of the placeholders in OneDrive storage to these cuts, not knowing what's going on with OneDrive for Business. The sync engines need to be aligned, and that still hasn't happened, though that's in process. So I think they have a lot of work to do on the OneDrive side. And I wish I had something more encouraging to say. On Windows Weekly, my co-host Paul Thurrott did an evaluation after they made those cuts, and he looked at all the other storage plans from Google, Box, Dropbox, and he looked at if you wanted to buy X amount of storage, who had the best deal after Microsoft did their cuts, and the answer was Microsoft still had the best deal. Not for the free giveaway part, but the actual part where you could get storage as part of buying Office 365 or doing some other plan.
You get a terabyte with an Office 365 subscription. That's still
a
still
lot
a
of
great
storage.
deal.
I know. I'm one of those people who've barely even touched my OneDrive, and I put a lot of things in OneDrive, but I do use Notepad. So
It makes you wonder. This seems to have burned a lot more goodwill than
It really did.
than it has encouraged
I know.
revenue or stemmed any losses. So a little
we're going to see what
strange.
happens there.
All right, we have time for one more question.
All right, well, thank you for the privilege for closing out the last questions. I am going to invite you to rant a little bit more. So you had mentioned something very interesting with the Hello Windows aspect and that not being released to the OEMs. And as a father of 2 young children who is constantly begged, "Daddy, would you sign us into the Xbox?" How in the world did they not tell the OEMs about a functionality that was built into the Xbox One with a Kinect for Windows 10? Pardon colloquialism, but WTF? That just does not make sense. We have 2, 3, borderline 4-year-old technology, depending upon who you've been talking to. Yet they didn't tell the OEMs about this? How are they putting the camera on the back side of the device?
Right.
Rant.
So I can't say for a fact they didn't tell the OEMs, but that's kind of what we're hearing. And that was for the Hello facial authentication technology in Windows 10. What they end up taking from Windows 10 and putting into the Xbox One will be interesting to see. They've started doing that, right? They've started bringing some of the Windows 10 technologies to Xbox One. But, I think there's still time. Uh-oh, he's going back up.
I'm sorry. So the Xbox One Kinect has been out for multiple years. It has the facial recognition technology. That's how I sign into my Xbox every time my lovely children are asking me to sign in.
Right.
This is not new technology for Windows 10. I have a real hard time believing it's new for Windows 10. This is something they've brought over from that platform, and it's meant to be mainstream.
Stop.
Sorry.
Hello is not the Kinect facial authentication technology. And Kinect, Kinect is one of those things that Microsoft, I feel like, was a little early on. And Microsoft gets dinged all the time for being late with things. I think they're too early on a lot of things too. And Kinect, I'm curious what's going to become of Kinect. I know that Microsoft hasn't killed Kinect, but we'll see what happens to Kinect in the future. I'm not sure it's going to be a big part of where things go.
Some might argue it's made its way into HoloLens, which we'll just leave as a teaser. That's something we can talk about next year when we're
I know,
down
right?
here.
Q1, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you going to get a developer kit? It's $3,000.
Yeah, it's only $3,000.
Okay.
Anyway, no, I'm probably not getting one, actually. On that note, actually, we're right at 7 o'clock.
Okay.
Thank you all, and thanks very much to Mary Jo Fuller.
Thanks.